I'll go through dozens of poems. Some of them are still handwritten. Sometimes they're just typed up stream of consciousness, and some of them have been reworked and been through the mental machine several times. And we'll try and leave the body and go to the place and try and feel what it might be like, what the atmosphere might feel like in an hour or two. And then we select on a mixture of that intuition and is there something we want to say tonight, or maybe we can just scribe by shuffling them. And then we just look and we throw some to one side and some to the other side, and the ones on this side are the ones we'll take. And there's usually 10 times more than we're going to need.
Yeah, how this started originally was that in 1989 I was already working with Jen on other things. And one of these things was a spoken word tour of Scandinavia that I helped set up, and we traveled Stockholm, Oslo, Copenhagen, and Jen was reading, and Paula, his wife at the time, was mixing cassette tapes, and it was very, very psychedelic and kind of a new concept, and very, very beautiful. So when that was over, we stayed in Stockholm and we took the entire package into a studio, the studio of Thomas Tibert, audio genius, who was my partner then in White Stains. And we had prepared some things, and we made some things right there and then. It was kind of a free flow of electronic ambient music, some rhythmic, structured, and some just free floating. And Jen recorded basically the same poetry that had been used live in the studio, and the result was staggering, and the result became the first White Stains album and the first cooperation with Jen, which was called At Stockholm, and came out in 1990. And then we have to move approximately 15 years until it was time again. And this time it was with the project Cotton Ferox, again with Thomas Tibert. And Jen came to Stockholm in 2002, and we recorded new poetry, beautiful poetry, in part inspired by 9/11 and his new relationship with Lady J and things like that. And it became another like incredibly soul-searching, revealing, beautiful album that came out in 2004, which was called Wordship. And then, of course, the logic of this and the reason why this new album is out now and not 6-7 years ago is the fact that an equal amount of time has passed. So the first one came out 30 years ago, and in midpoint 15 years ago there was the other one, and now comes the concluding part of a trilogy, and it's called Loyalty Doesn't End with Death.
It's really a very abstract, internalized thing. And then we pick them right near the end. Before we go on, we'll select, we'll sort of think those. And then still when we go on, we improvise and we'll just change them or go off on a complete tangent. Nothing is ever completely finished in that sense. So, and certain ones just seem to need to come alive several times, and some don't need to be alive more than once, but they're like living things, just as individual words are living things, so poems are living things, and statements within poems are living things. 1, 2. Oh, it's a separate one. How about that?
Oh, that's a different one underneath.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again.
The vocal recordings were recorded in New York by Sean Ragon in his beautiful studio, and it was a very focused couple of hours where Jen had brought in poetry, printed out, and just performed in the studio, and we used a microphone that, according to Sean, allegedly had been used by the Beatles for one of their 1960s albums, so that was kind of magical, and it was very swift. That's how Jen is. It's like a very focused kind of delivery. And then, of course, we had those vocal things. I decided when I made the music in my studio in Stockholm to not listen in. I made pieces that I found emotionally resonant with what was going on with me. In a way, a kind of poetic approach. And then I put Jen's pieces on top of this one and that one and that one, tried things out, adjusted a few things. But it was very like an intuitive flow. A flow process that turned out, emotionally resonant and psychedelic.
Well, I've always trusted your aesthetic anyway. You know that. We've done several of these now, and they always work beautifully. I'm always disappointed that we haven't got a Grammy yet for spoken word, because we certainly deserve one when you listen to the things that win. But it's just that they're not aware that they exist, and we're not on a major label and all the other blah-de-blah. But in certain ways, it's the purest form of expression, or it used to be. I guess it's not always now. We were just listening to Trip Reset, and all the lyrics in that could also just be poems, and they're all about certain positive situations that happen because of meeting Lady J. Like there's a track called Black Cat, and of course she's the black cat, and it says somewhere, I think I'll sparkle by. Well, Lady J always called DMT the sparkle. So there's lots of little clues too, and a lot of the poems that we write and lyrics and the words, they'll have, but that's what I'm talking about when they're alive. By adding that word sparkle, it's like a hologram. If you know it's about DMT and Lady J, then everything that's ever to do with Lady J is also in that word. And everything about DMT and Terence McKenna and so on is also in that word. And yet it says sparkle, which is about light hitting something. So one word can contain encyclopedias of information. And I think that's an art that sometimes gets forgotten. But we always use words that way, that they're loaded. And my favorite thing is to use the simplest phrase, but know that if only we explained why it's there, it's the Encyclopedia Britannica. So when it says, do you want a cup of tea? It's actually something else. It's telling you something else. And that journey happens very fast in the brain. But it happens. And there's this download of information that comes with each word and each combination of words. And also the spacing. By saying something after a gap, it changes its potential effect, of course.
Making pieces of music first, not really tied in with a specific poem, but as usual in this case, because Jen is so good, it's almost always like first takes, and the voice is so spot on. And it turned out that the music I made was similar. I was hardly any overdubs, hardly any like retakes. It just happens in the moment, and then you build another layer, and then you build another layer. And when you put these two elements together, for me, magic happens. It's kind of like definitely a third mind thing happening.
Everything offered is given. Possession is all of the law. Possession with equally ruthless pleasure. The supply of a soul, body, and dreams. To think completely and devour such memories. Know that we escape from a million gifts. Everything offered is given. Possession is all of the law. This is a grave of acceptance. We exist, manifest, donate all we have. In this universe, there is only captivity. Captivity of our lives. A perfect restraint. A perfect restraint, no slow. Take the best possible pains and truly await to return obediently. Everything you are is given. Next.
Working with Jen is amazing for many reasons. Not only because we've been friends for a long time, and we've made these now, these 3 albums, but it also that in itself, the long-term perspective, allows for you don't really have to explain things to each other. You don't have to. You respect each other and what you do. And as we've seen and heard, these things they mesh. They go really well together. And there's one track from these sessions called Third Minds Think Alike. And that kind of sums it up, is that we don't have to have any blueprints or any plans. We just go with the flow and create these poems and the music, and then these composites. Jen is very professional. Again, like I mentioned, it's usually always first takes. The voice is so wonderful and evocative and magical that in itself is an element of poetry. And then you have the words being read or performed by that voice. So I always find working with Jen very inspirational, partly because what's inside and what Jen brings out, but it's also a matter of watching a real professional, someone who really knows how to deliver and who's done this for an entire lifetime.
I really love doing it, and it's amazing to just walk onto a stage and there can be 1,000 people and you could hear a pin drop, and people who speak different languages listen intently to every single thing that we say. And the gaps are just as important for them to just be sitting in the words, almost like a liquid that's sort of floating around them, and they're in this liquid made out of words. And although they don't know the meanings based on the languages they speak, the voice still projects information because they respond correctly. If it's sad, or if it's haunting, or if it's a joke, people tend to respond correctly. And that's something that just totally fascinates me. How can we read a complicated abstract piece of information in 10 different countries and get an incredibly positive result each time. Sometimes we imagine that we are really close to comprehension. Sometimes we are close to comprehension. And then questions line up like captives, shackled like slaves, questions. And they're being led towards their doom, these questions. And they're standing, shackled, standing in front of the slavery tree, in front of a very puzzled firing squad. Sometimes we are so close to comprehension, to understanding each two-dimensional dimension. Is this really a three-dimensional hologram of a two-dimensional state? Perhaps we can grasp redemption by seeing clearly. And yet, the question is, the only question is, are we really simply like a firefly's last spark in that endless night that we never capture or put into a jar? Sometimes we really do imagine we are close to comprehension, and then the questions line up again, like captives, like slaves, shackled, lying on their backs, waiting for the galleon. And there they all are, chained together, being led to the boats, to be rowed to the prison. And in front of this puzzled firing squad are the ones who tried to get away. And they are like a firefly's last spark, lost at last in an endless night.
Yeah, I would say that the trilogy of albums at Stockholm, Wordship, and Loyalty Does Not End With Death, it's a trilogy of collaboration, of course, but it's also kind of a consistency there. I wouldn't call it logical, but it's tied together, like with some multicolored thread running through them. And it's like I said before, it's like a celebration of poetry. Poems, as Jen says, are living things, living beings. And we have given life to many beautiful poems by the words in themselves and the way they're put together and performed, but also by the music as a kind of a vehicle for the words to travel on or via. So I think it's a celebration of a friendship, it's a celebration of a project that has three parts, but it's also a celebration of a certain creative approach. You don't have to be very scientific about it. You don't have to be rational, perhaps you shouldn't be rational about it. No planning needed. You just do it, and whatever happens in the moment when you're recording the music and or the vocals and or in the mixing process, that's where the magic happens. And that for us, I think, has been a guidepost for living life, to have that kind of openness. Things happen in life, you don't look at it as a disaster or a super blessing. You incorporate everything that happens and you churn it in your own little existential filter, and it becomes something very beautiful, something that you could call magic on the one hand, but you could also call it poetry. I think for both Jen and me, it's kind of the same thing. You know, magic is poetry, poetry is magical, and our tools are these tools. It's the human voice, it's music, and it's how these things are put together and also disseminated and spread out into the world. And people have loved these albums. People have loved At Stockholm, people have loved Worship, and we of course hope that they will love the new one. Not only because it's Jan or because it's us in collaboration, but because they're really, really good and unusual. So many people have tried to do similar things, but I'm not saying they haven't succeeded, but I think our potion is quite powerful. And that's why I'm very happy that 3 is a magic number. And now we've made 3 albums, and it's I'm very, very proud of them.
Why should they buy and listen to this album? Because we are losing the ability to read and write and think faster than ever, thanks to these. And texting and Instagram and all these little games that come from these objects are training people to misunderstand what language is. They're training people to live in the most trivial part of language, which is just emojis. I mean, really? Emojis? And so, if you want to remember what language really does, and listen to somebody who's trying to tell you stories that are actually about the depth of human experiences and the pains and pleasures of life and existence, then you've come to the right place with this record. But if you want to distract yourself and be disconnected from the so-called reality that this particular illusion is, then stick with your telephone. But you'll be missing too much. You really will. You should spend a night with me. I worship at the gate of night. Flames dance, burning nothing. Lighter than exception. On days like these we go home to the old planet, when as a child we felt our roots in space. This is a word for the